All right, great job talking to each other. Now I need you to stop. All right. Well, thanks for being here. I'm excited for this conference. I've been looking forward to this for a long time, and excited for this workshop. And so I'm going to pray for us and then kind of get us started with a little bit of an opening activity. So I hope you're either brave or an extrovert. Might help to be both. So we'll see how that goes. But I'm neither, so yeah. But we can pray together, so let's do that. Father, we come before you this morning so grateful that we can gather in this place with people from all over. And God, that you've called us to a similar work in different contexts. And I'm so thankful that as we gather in this place today, that we can interact with one another, we can encourage one another, and we can stretch our minds together towards truth and goodness and beauty. And God, that you might show up in this place and be present among us and give us wisdom, give us understanding. God, we just want to do the work that you've called us to well. And so I pray that this conference will be a way that we can each grow in our ability as classical educators. And God, that you might be glorified through all that we say and do. And it's in the name of Jesus that we pray. Amen. Well, my name is Kyle Rapinchuk. I teach here at School of the Ozarks. In fact, I teach here in this room every day. Got the home field advantage today, so I'm kind of comfortable in this place. And as you heard, Scott and I kind of co-founded the Classical Thistle, and so that's something that we really started as a way of keeping ourselves accountable. We'd talk and have all these ideas, and it's like, we need to write some of this down. And then we never did. It's like, hey, maybe if we started a website and we actually had to publish things, we might follow through with that. And so that's kept us pretty accountable to do that. It's been a fun way for us to then start to meet other people and have conversations. And so really, today you showed up for the historical mind, thinking the past and the present. And this is something that really has been a fascination for me, especially lately. I would say that kind of in my history, if you will, I didn't really have a fantastic history education. I knew some of the details, I knew some of the facts that I was supposed to know, but it wasn't until I got into graduate school and started studying actually church history that I became fascinated with the discipline of history. And so over the next several years, I've really kind of been looking into this. In my PhD work, I did a course in historiography and became fascinated with the questions of history and how do we know the past. And just recently have been reading a couple of books, one called The Landscape of History by John Lewis Gaddis, and another one called Historical Thinking and Other Unnatural Acts, which was a title worth buying the book for, by Sam Weinberg. And have been reading those and thinking through those, having conversations with others. And so some of what we're going to do today is actually kind of out of those conversations and out of those books. But really what I want to get at the heart of today is that sometimes in history classrooms, our focus can be on names, dates, events. Oftentimes even the names, dates, and events get narrowed down simply to the wars and the battles that are fought within those wars. And there's kind of a tendency to fall into, this is the course of history. History is a war, here's the battles, here's the names, this is when it happened. 200 years later, here's the war, here's the battles, here's the names, this is what happened. And I think what we all recognize is there's so much more that we can explore. And part of that requires that we actually have the ability to think historically. And so that's really what I want us to focus on more today, is less about the content knowledge, though that's important, but about how we actually think about history. And so what I want us to do to start is actually a little bit of an exercise. I'm going to try to teach you this very briefly. But this is something that I think is helpful in kind of not only building our ability to think historically, but also in engaging our students and thinking through how well do our students understand what it is that they're reading and talking about. And so it's called a think aloud exercise. And so let me just give you kind of a little bit of background about that. The concept of a think aloud, it's not really anything foreign to us in our everyday life, and I don't think it's completely foreign to our education. For example, students sometimes have to explain the process by which they arrived at a solution. Now, typically, probably most of the time, I see this happen in a math class when a student ends up with the wrong answer. They're like, okay, that's not the correct answer, but you showed some work. Let's go through the work, explain how you got there. And they'll explain out loud, it's the think aloud process. Well, I did this, and then I thought that I was supposed to do this, and then I went and I did this next. We've identified the problem. in that step, what did you do wrong? And then you talk through it and work through it. So it's not completely foreign to us, although we're going to kind of take a little bit of a nuanced approach to what this looks like. So think alouds go beyond the mere explanation of a solution, really to the vocalization of our thoughts. It's almost like a form of inner speech. Some people probably talk to themselves more than others do, or at least admit that they talk to themselves more than other people do. And it's this kind of inner speech as we're thinking and talking to ourselves within our mind that in a think aloud we're trying to actually vocalize, that somebody else could hear what is the thought process going into this. And so I think think alouds actually are an invaluable tool for helping model for and then also train our students in historical thinking and interpreting historical sources. Now, the common problems with this would be that we either go the route of kind of getting really quiet and nervous and not really vocalizing out loud. We continue thinking in our head, but we forget to say it because that's kind of our normal process. The other end of the spectrum is we would become completely over-analytical, and something that we might do in 10 seconds, we spend 5 or 6 minutes trying to explain all of the processes behind that. So it takes a little bit of practice. And so in a book called The Mind's Best Task, David Perkins suggests 6 principles for think alouds. First of all, he says, say whatever's on your mind. Don't hold back hunches, guesses, wild ideas, images, intentions. Just say what's on your mind. Second, speak as continuously as possible. Say something at least once every 5 seconds, even if only I'm drawing a blank. Speak audibly. Watch out for your voice dropping as you become involved. Sometimes begin to talk under our breath and then become completely silent altogether. Speak as telegraphically as you please. Don't worry about complete sentences and eloquence. Sorry, Jim. After a wonderful speech about how we can grow in our understanding. Don't worry about eloquence. Don't over-explain or justify. Analyze no more than you would normally. And then 6th, don't elaborate past events. Get into the pattern of saying what you're thinking now, not of thinking for a while, then describing your thoughts. This is where it's a little bit different than what some people might call introspection, in which you think about it for a while. Maybe even have a class in which you tell students, hey, I'm going to leave you with a question. I want you to think about it tonight. Come back tomorrow and we're going to discuss it. That's an invaluable tool. But that's more introspection than what we're talking about here. Here we're actually talking aloud the process as we're thinking about it. So here's where I'm going to try this today. I'm going to ask you to be a little bit brave or a little bit extroverted. And I want you to kind of roughly get into the groups, maybe a few of you back there and right in here in the middle and then over off to the side. And I want you to try the think aloud process. Might not go as you had hoped, but just try the think aloud process. And basically what I want you to do is just very simply tell us what you were doing on this day last year. It's March 2nd, right? I think. I don't even know. That's how my think aloud would begin. What's today's date? I never know today's date. Let's see, Wednesday was the 28th, the 1st, the 2nd. So that's how we have a birthday in the room, so we should know the date. Yeah. So that's what I want you to do, is think about what were you doing on this date last year, and think that aloud. Don't think in your head and then tell someone. Think aloud that answer following these 6 steps. You guys think you can do that? Yeah. I think you can do this. All right, I'm going to give you a few minutes to do that, and I'm going to listen in and hear how awesome you are at it. Oh.
I can volunteer you. Okay, go ahead.
You would typically do it one at a time.
Okay.
Yeah, and we might not have time for everyone to go, but
Okay, here we go.
so if there's a really shy person, you can go last and then not go.
Okay.
It was.
Then I was here.
Except not quite.
I was thinking aloud here.
Yes.
You were thinking about going tomorrow.
I thought my think aloud earlier today. And so it'd kind of be cheating to share it, because then it was already thought aloud or quietly.
So where were y'all?
Okay, so I'll think aloud. I always ask my wife when I want to know where I was somewhere. And I'm guessing we were building a house. She's probably nailing up shit in the house. Is what he was doing. I have no idea.
Kind of patiently waiting to see what
help them understand the changes that
was actually going to open up, and if I would have an opportunity to do that.
I would walk in and say, well, you got to change this.
Yeah, you bring it.
Does that work quick? You got me 3 hours during the
Okay, about one more minute.
working with different leaders.
Do we end there? Keep going about.
You can spend all day thinking aloud.
Okay.
Feel free.
This is actually fairly easy because I talk to myself all the time.
See, Joel, I knew you'd be good at this. That's the best part of the think aloud. You don't have to be nervous about talking to other people. You're really just talking to yourself.
I do my best work though in the shower is what I'm thinking right now. So I don't know what the combination there is. I was probably leaving the military service.
Right now, I've got to get on the scales for all the stuff.
What's our
We have 30 seconds. Let's see how many you're doing.
So Team Pact is a nationwide program. It's like getting Christians back into anybody can learn a lot of homeschool, right? So we go to Team Pact
All right, I'm going to shut you down there. Sorry to interrupt you. It's rude to interrupt a man's thoughts, I understand. Sorry about that. Heard a lot of talking, so that's good. Thanks for being brave and venturing out there a little bit. Now, I think some of you just have really good memories. You actually knew exactly what you were doing last year, and you were just able to tell us. But some of you are probably like me, and you can't even remember what you had for lunch yesterday. Actually, can't remember what I had for lunch yesterday. I ate a peanut butter sandwich instead. Yeah, I did. So, sometimes in the process here, we might remember things and we can just communicate. But other times, we find that we're actually thinking aloud in the process. So hopefully some of that happened as you began doing that. But one of the things that we'll come back to later in this workshop is what that might look like as we look at written texts, as we begin to engage our students with some primary sources, and to say, how should we think about this? And have them think aloud through the process. And so I'll come back to that in just a little bit. But that was just kind of a fun way to get you talking and get you thinking out loud and to kind of break down some of those barriers that are sometimes instituted by chairs behind tables and all that kind of stuff. So I want to begin with just kind of a couple of quick illustrations. You may be following the news and seeing all of these various things going on in the world. And one of the ones that caught my attention recently as I was thinking about this presentation was just the predominance of coverage that's being given, written and kind of televised media coverage, to the tearing down of monuments. And there's a lot of discussion about why we should do that, why we shouldn't do that, and there's a lot of fighting back and forth. But I think one of the really interesting things is that in the midst of this conversation, what oftentimes happens is that on both sides, I'm sure that there are instances of this, but we're looking at the past in light of who we are in the present. And so we're reading our current context back into a historical context. Sam Weinberg, in his book, Historical Thinking and Other Unnatural Acts, says, quote, "Judging past actors by present standards wrests them from their own context and subjects them to ways of thinking that we, not they, have developed." He says elsewhere in the book, quote, "In other words, presentism, the act of viewing the past through the lens of the present, is not some bad habit we've fallen into. It is instead our psychological condition at rest, a way of thinking that requires little effort and comes quite naturally." And instead, I think we want to view the present through the lens of the past, as opposed to reading the present back into the past. Hence the subtitle of this workshop, Thinking the Past in the Present. And I think that that might be one of the things in this conversation that oftentimes gets overlooked, is that many well-meaning people have a particular view of what we should do about monuments based on the fact that they have only been taught to take their current context. And maybe this part of this is kind of a progressive, kind of chronological snobbery. We're later, therefore we're better, therefore they were wrong kind of thing. And there could be more to it than that. But I think in many times the debate can't even happen because we haven't been taught to think historically, and we're only able to read our context into theirs. The second illustration would be many of the modern history textbooks, and they give the idea that the narrative they present is strictly facts. There's this thought that history is a collection of facts, it's entirely objective, and there's no interpretation involved. You might get this even sometimes in biblical studies, as in, I don't even need to interpret it, it's just plain, it's simple, it's straightforward. But the idea of modern history textbooks, we oftentimes, not we as classical educators I hope, but many will teach history as a way of saying, well, history is objective facts, they're recorded in this textbook. Students, as they read the textbook, are taught to believe that no interpretation has been involved, this is what happened, end of story. And yet we find that this is the only perspective approach neglects the fact of what we might call various histories, different views of past events, the recognition that interpretation has been involved in the process of writing that historical textbook. You might see it as various ways of seeing the same event. You can think about eyewitnesses of a particular event would describe things in a little bit different way, or not knowing the full context may interpret something in a different way. The way that somebody interacts you might think is hostile, and then you realize that they're friends goofing off, and it may change your interpretation of those events based on the context that you're aware of that someone else may not be. Each of these history textbooks is in fact, although recording things that have happened, doing so through the lens that requires sometimes much interpretation. But it's being presented in a way that there is only one way of seeing this event. And so the single history that gets written is oftentimes determined by who tells the story. Now the challenge is, I think that the answer is not to throw out history because it requires interpretation. We don't say, therefore it's entirely subjective and we throw it out, we can't learn anything. We do need to tell the story. But the question then is, how do we tell the story? And I think that gets us towards some of these questions that we want to ask at the heart of historical thinking. How do we think the past in the present versus thinking the present into the past? And how do we tell the story, especially when it does require interpretation of the primary source evidence? So on account of these challenges, some really do question, why should we study history at all? Weinberg says, what is history good for? Why even teach it in schools? And then he says something that I think is really helpful. He says, my claim, this is Weinberg, in a nutshell, is that history holds the potential, only partly realized, of humanizing us in ways offered by few other areas in the school curriculum. And I think that this is key for us, but only if we do it well. So what does it mean to think historically? I just kind of brainstorm a few thoughts here that I think will lead us into some skills of history that I want us to talk about. But first of all, I think it's to see history like a web of connected events. You might think of a spider web in which everything in some sense or another is connected. And we want to see these connections not just within a specific time and place, but also around, or I guess across space and time. That we see these connections within a time period and across time periods, within a place and across places. So we can begin to see connections in history by what happened maybe in ancient Rome and then also in present-day America. Yeah.
Can you restate that? What
Yeah.
you said?
Yeah, so we want to see these connections across space and time, that part of it.
History holds the potential.
Oh, the quote from
Yeah.
holds the potential only partly realized of humanizing us in ways offered by few other areas in the school curriculum.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. That's from the Historical Thinking and Other Unnatural Acts by Sam Weinberg. Yes. All right. So we want to see these connections across space and time and begin to see how certain things connect across those time periods. We also want to understand the relationship between events and their context. And so we were just talking about the fact that context makes a significant difference with how we interpret particular events. And if we don't understand the historical context, there's a really high likelihood that we're going to misinterpret that particular historical event. And then we want to understand the present in light of the past. We want the past and what we can learn from there to begin to speak into our understanding of the present. A second thing that we want to see is we want to trace processes from knowledge to outcomes. And so one of these ways is that we need to discern causation. When we look at historical events, we want to consider what are the causes that led to that particular outcome, that particular consequence. And so there's a number of different ways of looking at this, and we'll talk about some of them as we move forward. Things like contingent versus categorical causation, what John Lewis Gaddis calls sensitive dependence on initial conditions. I'll give you some definitions of those later. But I think it's important for us to recognize that we can identify certain things, certain causes that lead to particular consequences or outcomes. And that's part of what it means to think historically, understanding why certain things happened and how they happened, and to see what outcomes result from that. And then I think there's an important step in here that when we talk about history and we talk about moving towards objectivity, moving towards an understanding of truth, sometimes people get the idea, and I think this happens maybe more in mathematics, the really objective ones that people talk about. Things like history is sometimes we have this false idea that in order for something to be true, we just have to be really bland about it. Can't be passionate about it. Can't be passionate about truth because then you're biased, which is just a false notion. But oftentimes we find ourselves running into that, and you'll probably have encountered a modern history textbook, and they're oftentimes incredibly boring to read because nobody seems to care about what they're writing about, because there's a dispassionate separation from the actual events that they're encountering. Because if you start to be passionate about it, well, then you can't be telling me an unbiased truth about it. And so that's something that I think we need to talk about a little bit. Weinberg tells the story. He did this survey in which he got a number of different teachers involved, and he gave them some history textbooks and had them read about a period in kind of just in the late 1700s in America. And he was talking about this, post Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, what was life like during that time period? And they read a little excerpt from a modern textbook and talked about the life of women, and it was just this one paragraph. And this woman that he calls Colleen, I don't think that was her actual name, calls Colleen. They then read a selection from a journal from Martha Ballard that then got published as a midwife's tale, and begins exploring that. And as she's reading about what this woman did in her life and some of the things that were going on, she became very angry at the textbook. It's this was a total misrepresentation of what women did during that time period, and she's getting all fired up. And so he then turned around and he had them rewrite the textbook portion. And I want you to hear what he says about this. He says, quote, "Unrestrained passion distorts the story we seek to tell. The balancing of perspectives requires us to step back and see things in other ways, an exceedingly difficult thing to do when anger sears our gut. But Colleen went to the other extreme. Rather than compensating for her subjectivity by sharing it with her reader, she tried to construct a story without a teller to deal with her deep feelings by pretending they did not exist." And so here she was so fired up about the way that this textbook had got it wrong. And as she tried to rewrite it, he says she told it as one without a teller. A dispassionate, separated, here are the facts. And she had changed some of the facts now to include some of the things she had learned. But he found that this historical thinking task is oftentimes so ingrained in us to be this dispassionate, separated approach that there's a lot of work for us to do. And many of you may have students who didn't grow up in classical Christian education. And they show up and maybe they've had a public school history education. And they find themselves kind of saying those things. Well, you can't do such and such, or history's not like that, or how can you say, and you might receive some challenges on that.
Are you saying that this interpretation of history is very much like Professor Gradgrind in modern times asking what a horse is.
Yeah, in the Hard Times book by Dickens. Yeah, absolutely.
Hard times, not modern days.
Yeah, yeah. That book is fun. I have a good story about that book. I'll tell you sometime. All right. So what I want to move on to is to discuss a little bit here some of the skills of historical thinking. And here's the reason I want to put it in these terms. And I'll actually talk in my plenary address tomorrow about how sometimes we get into this debate about whether it's content or skills, and I'm going to suggest that those are both important in leading us to something more important. So it's kind of both and neither, which is a horrible answer, so I guess you'll have to show up tomorrow. But what fascinated me in this approach, and I've witnessed this firsthand, is that as Weinberg did this study, he began to explore what would it look like if I took like AP top-level students going to great colleges, got great SAT scores, and knew their history knowledge, and put them up against historians in oftentimes disciplines that they hadn't really studied much. And so what he did is he would give them some primary source material from early America, for instance. And he would take a historian, but a medievalist, or an ancient historian, or like a 20th century European historian, someone who has a very specific expertise, but not in early America. In fact, they hadn't had a class in early American history since college. So it would have been a number of years for them, and put them up against these students who were kind of top in their class in their American history class. What was fascinating is he did kind of it wasn't necessarily a control study, but he did take a little quiz at the beginning for historical facts. And many of the students actually outscored these professional historians because they had been studying the particular facts of history, and these historians did not. But when they handed them the primary source texts, the richness of the interpretation from the historians was so much greater than the high school students, even though they didn't have the historical knowledge that we consider like absolutely vital. So you might say, if you're going to be an educated person, you have to know this about American history. But these people were professional historians and they didn't know that. And yet, by giving them a text, they knew enough, and they had certain, apparently, skills of history to be able to engage that primary source text. And so what Weinberg tries to explore, and what I've been trying to explore, is what is it, like what is that it factor? What did they have that then these students of history, even though they had the factual knowledge, didn't have at the same time? And if we can isolate and identify what it is that they've got, what skills they have, then maybe we can start working towards how we get our students there. And that's really what this is an introduction to. I don't claim that you're going to leave here today. Maybe I should have told you that at the beginning. You're stuck now. I don't think this is going to answer everything today, but I do think that for me it's been a start in understanding if we can figure out what this might look like, we can start working our students towards that. And it reminds me of what Jim just shared with us. If we can think about what it actually looks like to be a great writer, we see those discrete skills within like the progymnosmata, and we can isolate those in some ways, but they're always working us towards a greater synthesis at the end. And so that's kind of, I think, what we want to do with historical thinking. So let me kind of quickly run through some of these so that I'll have some time to maybe take some questions at the end or give you some examples. But I've identified 7 different skills, and in some ways these kind of build upon one another. So you might almost see this as a historical process, if you will. And so the first is that we need to identify and assess different types of historical causation. Now, I've listened to some really good presentations. I'd point you to Chris Schlecht has done this a couple of times at the ACCS conference, in which he talks about environmental, social, intellectual, cultural, ethical, and technological causes. I think I put those on your handout so I could do it really fast. And I'll maybe direct you to that, or I can talk you through that process a little bit later on and kind of how that works itself out. It's a fascinating presentation he's given. But these are just some of those historical causation things. And you notice that it's not just kind of one kind of causation, that it helps us to recognize that there might be environmental or social. I almost added one. I was talking with a friend of mine who teaches at the college. He's in the history department. And he's reading a book called Coffee, a Biography. At least I think that's the name of it. And I thought, wow, that's fascinating. So I asked him about it. He started telling me a little bit. He said that during this particular era of history, they didn't have clean water. And so it was actually dangerous to drink water. And so they drank a lot of alcohol because it was actually safer for them to drink alcohol. When coffee came along, they were actually able to drink coffee as a means of kind of being healthy, and as opposed to drinking, dirty water or whatever. And so he's going through explaining this to me, and he said, it's kind of fascinating in some ways that, the Enlightenment may have come about because people were not drunk all the time, but instead hyped up on caffeine. And I just thought, nutritional causation. So maybe that's a new one. If you're convinced, you can add it to the list. But I thought, that's just fascinating to think about coffee. When you explore the history of coffee, maybe it did have some influences on certain things. Now, you'd have to defend that there's actual a link between that particular cause and some kind of outcome, but it's kind of fun to think about. So had a good time talking with him about that. But yeah, there's these various kinds of causation. So we don't have to just look in terms of the typical things we think about when we talk about history. We can look at environmental causes. We can talk about technology, and those things do make an impact. So that's just kind of the first step. We need to recognize various kinds of historical causation. The second thing is that we want to begin to learn how to connect those causes with their consequences. And this is where I'm going to spend kind of most of the time here. And I'm going to rely a lot on John Lewis Gaddis's book, The Landscape of History, which I'd highly recommend to you. But he begins by talking about the fact that there's a distinction between the immediate, the intermediate, and the distant. I think if you ask in some ways, we can recognize that historical causation can go way, way, way back. In fact, in some ways, I keep appealing to Jim because he had such a great talk at the beginning there. But when we talk about classical Christian education as repairing the ruins of our first parents, Adam and Eve's sin is like a distant historical causation, right? But it's also a pretty significant one. Hey, why is everything the way it is? Because Adam blew it. Is actually a historical causation answer. I would accept that as a correct answer on a test, right? But oftentimes what begins to happen is we could go further back, and the better historian that you are, the more and more you can trace causes out further back in history. And so what we want to recognize is that oftentimes these immediate causes are the ones that we're going to be talking about leading to a particular consequence, not necessarily something distant, unless that distant one has a really strong correlation in some of these other areas. And so what we want to do is we want to begin with some kind of an event and then trace back that causation. And you could do this kind of ad infinitum, right? But he talks about the principle of diminishing relevance. Eventually you realize the point that you're like, yeah, I traced that out, but I don't think that really makes such a huge difference. And so there's kind of a general historian maxim, you might say, that the greater the time that separates a cause from a consequence, the less relevant we presume that cause to be. Notice we presume it to be. We don't automatically dismiss it, but we just kind of think the further away it is from the event we're trying to explain, it's greater likelihood that it's in the distant as opposed to the immediate cause. He also talks about, again, we're all still in number 2, connecting causes with consequences, the distinction between the exceptional and the general. And this is where context really comes into play. The dependency of sufficient causes upon necessary causes. He gives the illustration, Gaddis does, of a man who's walking on a road on the side of the cliff. And he takes a misstep and he plummets to his death off the cliff. And the idea here is that it's really the context that matters, right? The immediate causation would be he took a misstep, right? Had he not misstepped, he would have continued on the path and been fine. Now we can draw out other causation, like someone built the road. That mountain was there, and so on and so forth. You could draw out a lot of other things. But when we talk about why did that man die, we would say he took a misstep and fell off the cliff. And that would be a sufficient, I think, explanation for what's going on. So it's necessary that the path was there. It's necessary that he was walking on it. It's necessary that the mountain existed in the first place. But as far as explaining it as a sufficient cause, he has to take that misstep. And so the context really matters. And so this is where that idea of sensitive dependence on initial conditions comes in. That's the idea that particular actions had larger consequences than we might otherwise have expected. And this happens a lot not a lot, but it happens sometimes in history. And this is why I think it's really difficult, even though we might see patterns throughout history, it's really difficult for us to then use history to predict the future. Social sciences do that a lot, and sometimes economic forecasting is accurate, and sometimes they've completely missed the mark. Weather forecasting in Missouri is notoriously terrible because nobody knows what happens with the weather in Missouri. But elsewhere that I hear that they're a little bit more on point more regularly. But we think about other times that we try to forecast the future, and there are certainly times in which we go, the patterns I see of history might suggest that this is going to be the case. But it makes it really difficult to forecast the future because we have these kinds of sensitive dependence on initial conditions. These moments where something happens that has a greater impact than we might have expected. A small thing that all of a sudden, whoa, I didn't know that that would have such a big impact. Maybe that's dumping some tea into the harbor. Something like that. And you go, wow, I didn't quite realize that that was going to stir people up as much as it did, or something like that. It's a terrible example. I should have written out a good one. The question then is, how do we know when we encounter such kinds of things? And we might talk about like phase transitions as something has changed. The term that you oftentimes hear in science is like a punctuated equilibrium. Or what we might kind of just in terms of life call abrupt or destabilizing changes. Like there's no going back from this point. Something's clearly changed, and we see that clear transition at that point. You might call it a point of no return. Next, we also have a distinction between the factual and the counterfactual. Gaddis considers this the, quote, historical equivalent of laboratory experimentation in the physical sciences. Using their imagination, historians were to perform procedures similar to what chemists and physicists do with their test tubes, centrifuges, and cloud chambers. They would revisit the past, varying conditions as they did so, to try to see which would produce different results. They would do this by means of counterfactuals. And so counterfactual reasoning needs to proceed by some rules. We can't just make anything up. First of all, we need to change a single variable at a time. It doesn't help if we change 4 variables and see, this is how it could have happened. We've changed too many different things. So we change one variable at a time. We also can't change a single variable if that action involved could not have taken place at that time. Well, why didn't we deal with World War I the same way we did with World War II by dropping an atomic bomb? Because they didn't exist. And so you have to actually, in counterfactuals, have something that's possible or plausible as another means. How could things have gone differently if Japan had not bombed Pearl Harbor? Is now one thing that we could change, and we can kind of explain things away. As we can go through that process of counterfactuals, it may help us understand the significance of that particular causation. If we can come up with some different scenarios of what would have happened in World War II had Japan not bombed Pearl Harbor, we might be in a position to talk about how significant Pearl Harbor was as an act of causation that leads to American involvement in the war, things like that. All right, so that's just kind of a brief discussion to get you some of those things. And again, we can talk a little bit more later. Third, the research skills. This is where our students begin to learn how to do information retrieval. Like, how do I go to the library and find a book? That's a fascinatingly difficult one today with the internet. I'll just Google it, and you might find something good, or you might find something absolutely terrible. But information retrieval, teaching them how and where to find this kind of information, that then becomes significant with the next step of evaluating those sources. They may know how to find a website, but do they know how to evaluate whether that website is credible as opposed to another website? Does John's blog on history match up with something else that they might encounter? Like, hey, I found this journal article from, we're probably on a better path here than we are from John's blog on history, although John might be a great historian, you never know, right? There's great things on the internet. Direct you to the Classical Thistle. Shameless plug for our website. And then I think what is really significant then is once they've learned to retrieve those sources, evaluate those sources, what is their facility with those sources? Do they know how to use them? They need to learn how to start with archives, artifacts, and memories. and deduce the processes that produce them, to be able to read a primary source and then actually to draw out of that understanding. And that's a real struggle when we're first starting in the process. But it's so exciting to watch a student who didn't have a clue the first time they opened a book, then later on in the process go, wait, so that means, and you're like ready to do a dance in front of everyone, but you know you can't dance and it'd be a little bit awkward, but you do it anyway, but not here because they're filming, so I'm not going to do that. But I think that that's one of the really fun things is as we've trained students in the ability to have facility with these sources, that they could do some really neat stuff. All right, fourth, I got to move faster, I'm sorry. Develop meaningful comparisons across different historical contexts. That's something we've already talked about a little bit. And so we kind of have this tyranny of the present, this chronological snobbery sometimes, that progress just means we're later in history, later down the timeline. And I think you guys recognize that that's not a good place for us to be. And so if we can take seriously what I think Chesterton calls the democracy of the dead, and allow our ancestors a voice in the conversation, I think that that helps clarify for us how we can make those meaningful comparisons. Because we don't say, well, that was 200 years ago, it's less valuable than today. If we put them on the same playing field and we allow our ancestors to speak as well, now we're looking at, we can make correspondence between those things. All right, number 5. From this point, we can now integrate historical material with other disciplines. What do we know about mathematics and science? What do we know about literature at the time? Maybe we have literary causation. Maybe some, great new book is out in the 14th century and it's changed the way that people view everything. And that plays itself into our historical context and how we're going to do that. So we want to integrate historical material once we've been wrestling with the text and understand what's going on with some other disciplines. 6th, we want empathy for historical actors. We want to make responsible moral judgments about them. I think this harkens back in some ways to our monuments discussion, right? Are we immediately identifying certain individuals and giving them titles based on our modern conceptions of things, or are we beginning from a position of empathy? Why don't I actually get to know that person? And what's fascinating is we have, and this is one of the benefits of the internet, almost immediate access to so many primary sources, journals that people wrote that are now just published online, that we can access. There's really no excuse other than laziness if we won't go and actually say, but was that person really that way? Let me go and see. And it's seemingly endless amounts of information that will give us a better picture of what that person was like. And so I think it's just a charitability toward the past. Let's have some empathy and let's give them the benefit of the doubt as we then explore who they were and why they acted as they did. And we might in the end make a moral judgment that somebody was in the wrong, was in fact a bad person, and maybe if it came to a monument, then you would say, yeah, take it down. But oftentimes, I think most of the times, we're not having those conversations because we haven't been taught how to do it, or we just don't want to put in the work to do it. And finally, kind of the last step of this history process is then constructing a narrative. Maybe you don't write your own history textbook, but communicating this story to somebody else, having that conversation. And this is what historians kind of call the act of simulation. And so we want to try and answer the question at that point in narration, how could this have happened? And we want to find kind of the closest possible fit, right? It's like the idea of fitness. We want to find the closest possible fit between what we are communicating and what we've identified as the causation and the outcomes and what actually happened. And oftentimes there is some realm in there in which we can't be 100% certain. There is a need for interpretation. We do have to wrestle with those things. And as we do so, there are some things that we can look at. Again, to really try to explore really well what are the causes, how well can we tie those causes to an outcome. The stronger those ties are, the better sense we have of understanding what happened in that event. And now we can begin to narrate that because we understand the context and we've brought it into relation with other disciplines. So that's really kind of where we're trying to move. So let me throw a few ideas out here for you really quick, and then I'll take your questions and comments about how you've tried to teach history, and you can teach me a lot of stuff because I need it. All right. First of all, when we talk about how do we teach history, I think we begin by building a foundation of historical knowledge in the grammar stage. Right? I love the timeline. I love kids learning through repetition the history. They learn key names, dates, events. Right? I'm not trying to hate on those when I say that's not the whole of history. That's a invaluable tool to have when you can all of a sudden know that that happened after that. If you're trying to identify causation, you kind of need to know what came first and what came last. Otherwise, you get into some weird time travel type stuff, which might be fun, but now we're in the realm of science fiction and not history. At least I think. I don't think anyone's invented a time machine. So as we begin with that kind of historical knowledge in the grammar stage, we move on, I think, throughout the years. And I'd be curious to hear from some of you how early you start moving in some of these other, what we might call discrete skills, to these higher level history thinking skills, use of sources that I think typically gets pushed back to the dialectic and rhetoric stages, but perhaps there are ways that you integrate this with some of the younger students as well. I do think it's true that the more historical knowledge we have, the better chance we have of making connections. So I do think we should store up that historical knowledge. And yet, as we talked about before, some really good historians who didn't have the background knowledge that these high school students had were able to do significantly more because they had built these skills. And so I think that looks probably in the history classroom like less lecture, more discussion, debate, research, projects that get the students enacting, engaging in and with, and discussing history, having these conversations about historical causation. Maybe that's as an entire class. My class sizes are from 20 to 25. And so when you get an entire class conversation, you kind of have no idea where that's going to go. Maybe you have fewer students, and that would be a little bit easier to manage. But you can break up a larger class into smaller groups, and you can wander around and listen to the smaller groups have these conversations, and then bring them all back together and have a representative from each group share some of the things they came up with. So all the class is learning from that. I can kind of follow up with everyone and make sure nothing really wacky happened. And you can kind of learn through that process of collaboration. And oftentimes one-on-one discussions are really helpful, whether that's two students or whether you actually take a moment during some kind of project work day and go, hey, I'm gonna talk with you. What do you think about this? Work with me on this, and that process. I think there's some really great projects that I've heard of that you can actually put into practice. One of those is to give students a primary source document and have them pretend to be museum curators. And they're going to be the ones who actually have to present this to the public and say, hey, this is what we have in our museum. Here it is. You explain it. You explain the historical context, its significance, and they've got to be the ones who annotate the documents that go along with it, like the little placards, or that's not the right word. Maybe it is. Anyway, whatever. Those things that you read, at museums, that stuff. Okay, yeah. My vocabulary has disappeared at this point. You can learn history by writing it, as Weinberg did, having these teachers, but you can also have students. Okay, having now read these primary source documents, how would you try to put that into a paragraph summary of what's going on? Have them write the history, have them tell the story themselves. And then I really like the idea of exploring more and more what it would look like for us to use think-alouds. And so what I've given you as a handout is an example of a couple of teachers that Weinberg did this process with Abraham Lincoln. And he was trying to get at the heart of some of the things that Lincoln said in our minds today sounded racist. But we also talk about Lincoln as the great emancipator, the one who freed the slaves. And so how do we reconcile seemingly racist statements with a guy who freed them from slavery? Well, you read one history textbook who says he was a racist. You read the other one who say that he was nowhere close to that, and he had this perfect, and you're just like, what do I believe? And so what he did was he gave them these sources and had them read them. And there's a couple of different teachers on there. I think it's Ted and Ellen. And there's 4 examples, and I gave you the short little blurb that they read. I'm going to teach you how to use this since I pulled it out of context and we don't have time. But it has a short little excerpt that they read, and then it has some of the transcript of how they thought aloud through the process. And I didn't give you much of Ted because Ted's were subpar. Ellen's were much better. But you can kind of see the process of what she's trying to think through and how she's trying to bring these texts together and provide some kind of synthesis. I could explain this and this and this in the context. This gives me a more holistic picture of the person that Abraham Lincoln was and what he actually believed in his specific historical context. So there's some fun things in there I'd encourage you to explore, or just get the entire book. That's from Sam Weinberg's historical thinking book that I think you'd enjoy. But I think what this does is it helps us see how well students are actually identifying with, understanding, and putting into practice those 7 history skills. And it gives us, I think, a really good way to go, okay, this student's not getting it. Let me help them through the process, because I can actually hear their process. And I can see where they're kind of, I don't want to say failing, but where they're not quite reaching the potential that they think they have. Okay. Well, I'm going to end with a quote, and then I didn't leave time. I'm terrible. I'm so sorry. History teaches us a way to make choices, to balance opinions, to tell stories, and to become uneasy when necessary about the stories we tell. Once again, Weinberg says, history holds the potential, only partly realized, of humanizing us in ways offered by few other areas in the school curriculum. And I think he's right, but only if we do it well. So I hope this has been a helpful start. So with that, I'm done. We're kind of over time, but we still have 10 minutes before the next session begins. So if you have questions for me, please ask, but thanks for being here.